Hey everyone, we're going to be looking at chapter 29 here. We'll be looking at Asia, primarily Asia, Arab Revolt, India, Gandhi, some different industrialization, modernization in China, the Middle East, generally things like that in this time period. First World War's impact on national trends. You can see the dates here, 1914 to 39. So basically this is the inter-period, primarily between wars. In the next chapter we'll look at the Depression, the inter-period between wars, the Depression, the build-up to World War II, and then we get into World War II. Asian reaction to the war in Europe. Alright, we'll do a little context here. Okay. So a lot of these changes in colonies across Asia was tremendous during and after the war. It resulted in independence movements all across the continent, civil war among Asian states, as well as between them and European states. Many of them had been weakened during the war. So by the end of this time period, we're looking at most Asian countries that were under the control of a European power achieved independence, or some form of independence. So that is a good thing as a result of the war. A lot of negative consequences of World War I, and especially the Treaty of Versailles that ended the war. Most are negative, but there are a few good things that do come out of it geopolitically. The British and the French made all kinds of populations to their colonies all across the world, basically to gain their support for the war, to gain troops, supplies, lots of promises to gain assistance for the war effort. This was, England and France were kind of on the ropes for much of the war. They promised him self-rule, they promised him independence, basically to satisfy their nationalistic ideas for self-rule, independence, and freedom. Now, after the war, England and France seemed to reconsider most of this. They were heavily damaged, heavily in debt, massive damage to their infrastructures, their trade, their economics, millions dead. Both of these countries, which were really the two big winners of the war, they rethought a lot of this and decided they didn't necessarily want to follow through on many of these promises. However, the colonial peoples didn't forget. They remembered these promises. They remembered some of these treaties that were written. They remembered the deals that were made. And many of these Republican ideals, these ideas of freedom and equality that had been so intrinsic to European economic and political structuring for centuries, these colonies wanted that. Many of these colonies wanted this independence. They didn't forget it. After the war, U.S. President Woodrow Wilson's 14-point plan, he included his belief in national self-determination for European nations. The idea that all European nations should be able to determine, have self-determination, free and clear elections, things like this. After the war, he believed this. This is specifically talking about Europe. He proposed peace negotiations in Versailles, and much of that was rejected. As I mentioned in the previous chapter, of his 14 points, really only one ever came to full fruition, and that really was what becomes the League of Nations. I almost said United Nations. That's not the League of Nations, which ultimately is a complete failure. The mandate system comes out of the Treaty of Versailles, comes out of this agreement and understanding between the winners of the war. They wanted to reestablish their dominance in Asia and Africa. They wanted to control the resources, the oil, they wanted markets, etc. All the same stuff that colonies have been doing for 200 plus years. These mandates, they call them, the idea of a mandate is something you must do. A mandate is something you're required to do, usually in exchange for something. The idea was these colonies were mandated. They were mandates. Europeans had to take care of these colonies. This is another form of neo-colonialism. It's an extension of colonialism with like some rules attached. Oh, we are going to continue to be a colonial power. You're going to continue to work and trade with us. but we are going to do some things for you. We're going to bring in infrastructure. We're going to build roads and bridges. We're going to build schools and hospitals, things like this. However, we're still basically the ones running the big show, running the biggest geopolitical stuff, your foreign relations, a lot of that. You have to trade exclusively with us, and you have to buy our goods, things like this. So this is the way they take a lot of these Middle Eastern countries, land, and say, well, we're going to continue to sort of watch over you as long as we keep these economic ties. It was really all about money and resources. Many of these old colonies of Germany and the Ottoman Empire in the Middle East and Northern Africa were now basically controlled or taken over by England and France. League of Nations creates these permanent mandates. Now, it's a two-way street. On paper, it's a two-way street. England is going to be over Iraq, for instance, and then England is going to do all these things for Iraq. It's going to make sure they have infrastructure and railroads and all these social services, and helps them basically elevate the status of the country, raise their GDP, increase the standard of living, all things like this. In exchange, Iraq basically is still sort of quasi-governed by England. That is the idea behind it. And this is sort of how the League of Nations rationalizes it. Hey, we're going to continue to force these countries, these developing nations, to be under the banner of these other European larger nations, but we're going to do all kinds of things for them. It's not like colonialism used to be, where we just basically sucked all life out of the countries. We're going to now put a bunch back in. And some of that is true. But ultimately, these countries still don't have independence, and they're still basically being ruled by a foreign nation, or under all kinds of restrictions and laws and economic policies that benefit the foreign nation, like England or France, for instance. Now, there was another stipulation, which was less adhered to, that they were supposed to, as a mandate, they were supposed to help foster these nations' political systems to where they could eventually become democratic republics, where they could eventually have some type of democratic idealism and eventually have self-rule. That's the idea of the mandate. It's not supposed to be permanent. It's supposed to be a temporary system, but it's indefinite, which means there is not a set end time. It's supposed to be a temporary system that transitions the country into full independence and freedom. Sounds good on paper. It often didn't work out quite that well. For many, this mandate system equal to basically the spoils of war. We won the war. Germany can't pay us back money, so we're going to take their colonies and we're going to start using and sapping their resources. That's ultimately really what ends up happening to much of the Middle East and much of Northern Africa. These are a lot of regions that there were a lot of German and Ottoman Empire, which they were both the enemies. German and Ottoman Empire were both losers in the war. Communists are interesting. The communists in the Soviet Union basically is now the Soviet Union. They denounce Europe. They denounce American imperialism. They basically declare us not enemies, but adversaries economically, not militarily. But they denounce our economic systems and our mandate system. Because, by the way, did Russia get any of these mandates? No. Even though Russia was... how to say it? I guess they weren't technically a winner, because Russia signed a treaty and basically bowed out of the war with the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. They bowed out of the war before the end. So technically Russia didn't win or lose. They peace treated their way out of it. Very sore losers, and if you want to use the losers in quotes. They didn't get anything from the Treaty of Versailles. They really weren't included in the negotiations. The mandates generally went to England and France. The U.S. got a little bit, but not much, really. So what do they start doing is they start spreading their influence into China, into French Indochina. You have North, that is basically Southeast China, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos region. And so Russia starts pushing into those areas. And this is a land grab of Soviet and China both trying to grab land and territory, because even though they were both sort of on the side of the winner, Soviet Union maybe not, but China was. China was on the side of the victors. China was an ally of the U.S. They got jack from the war. They wanted their peace, and so they start becoming more aggressive geopolitically, invading, expanding, making treaties, basically trying to expand their own colonialism, which China had never really done much of. There's a reason we see some of that happening in the 20s and 30s in China, which we'll talk about later. Partition of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire in 1914 was this green area, all of this at the time of the war. After, we have the British Protectorate, all of northern, this over here, the coast, the Red Sea going into the Arabian Sea and the Indian Ocean, northern Africa, Egypt. After the war, we have British mandates right here, Iraq and Transjordan region going into Palestine, which, eventually that's Israel. French mandates, Syria here region. We also have other French mandates in northern Africa that it's not shown on the map. Now, some of these countries do get independence within several years. We see Egypt get independence. We see Turkey, which becomes basically what's left of the Ottoman Empire, independence. We do see some of them getting this. But what should be noted, even when these countries get independence and self-rule, there have been laws and treaties and policies signed with the European country that was their mandate country that requires them, in some cases, like Iraq, for instance, had to continue to sell their oil to England for the next 20 years. So even when the mandate expired and Iraq is now technically independent, they're still in a tightly economic grip of a foreign European nation that they basically are subservient to for all their economic authority or power, or for their income. They have to sell the majority of their oil to these countries, for instance, Middle Eastern countries. So even when it's over, they're still indebted or legally tied to these countries in these very involved treaties and business deals. National movements in the Middle East, England and France helped to destroy the Ottoman Empire. We do see the revolt of the Ottoman Empire. Basically, it ends, and the Ottoman Empire does collapse by the end of the war. Well, there was an Arab movement, this Arab movement which does occur in the Middle East and Southeast Europe. The initial stages of this included definitely ethnic intolerance for minority groups. For instance, the Turkish government slaughtering probably as many as 1 million Armenians were murdered by the Turks under the cover of the war, right? And 18 and 19 it goes all the way back to 1909, but the majority were killed 18 and 19 under cover of the war. We see as many as 1 million Armenian Christians that were slaughtered. And we think the reason behind this, a lot of it wasn't specifically that those Armenian Christians were enemies of the Ottoman Empire. It's what they represented. They represented Christianity, which was the power of Europe, which was almost exclusively Christian, and the way it was bearing down and basically helped dismantle and destroy the Ottoman Empire. So simply put, Christians were the enemies. Armenians were Christians, or this group of Armenians were Christians, and so they were a ready target. The Ottoman Turks couldn't get out and attack Germany, they couldn't get out and attack England or France, so they killed the enemy that was closest to them, which unfortunately was these Armenians in southeastern Europe. Arabs were in conflict with Turkish people. Not to be confused, Arab people are from the Arabian Peninsula, basically more of the southeastern Middle East, and then Turks are more the north and northwest central of Middle East. Turks and Arabs were all constantly in conflict with each other. Even though they were all nominally Muslim, they had very different views. We see the Turks, the Ottoman Empire, being much more modernistic, much more lenient in Muslim rule, as opposed to, we get to the Arab Peninsula, it is much more traditional, much more old school. We have differences of some Shia, some Sunni, so we have very different views of Islam among different populations. So it isn't like the entire Islamic community was a united front. There were lots of internal strifes and wars and internal conflicts going on within Muslims themselves over the different interpretations of the Quran laws and the traditions, as well as the way the governments was run, as well as alliances. Some Middle Eastern countries made willing alliances with European powers, knowing the benefits they would get economically and politically and militarily. And some others wholly rejected European, basically mingling in Middle East affairs. And so you have, at times, Middle Eastern countries fighting each other over different things. And sometimes Europeans would hop in. Sometimes England and France would hop in on one side or the other. US would get involved. It is, in every way, confusing. And beyond the scope of this class to really go into any more detail than this. Arab-British allies. Let's see what else we have going on here. Oh, the news, okay. Let's see. We have the Ottoman Empire during the First World War. We talked about that. Arabs were hoping for a united Arab state after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. They were lied to by the British and French again. The British and French promised them independence. This is basically the Arabian Peninsula region. France controlled parts of the north and the west. England controlled much of the coastal areas. And again, they were lied. They were lied to about this idea of a united Arab state, which has never happened. It's never happened even though they gained independence. Most of these regions, most of these places gained independence in the 20s and 30s. It still has never happened. So this united Arab state was probably never going to happen. Probably the belief was because the Ottoman Empire had been a united Muslim empire for, again, centuries. Maybe Arabs thought that they could continue that tradition, even though most of the Arabian Peninsula was not actually part of the Ottoman Empire. That's sort of the diversity there between the different Muslim views. Northern Middle Eastern versus South and Southeastern Middle Eastern, often differing views. In actuality, England and France had actually entered into a secret pact during the war, a secret treaty known as the Sykes-Picot Agreement. And what England and France had agreed to do is basically divide up the Middle East among themselves to use it how they needed for resources and markets. Lebanon, Syria, Turkey, Palestine, Jordan, Iraq. Basically all this basically it was like two people sitting at a table playing a game and just divvying up the cards. I'll take these, you take these, and that was what they agreed to do. We know, and this treaty goes back to during the war, we know that basically all the promises England and France made to the colonies they were lies. They simply wanted and needed their support during the war to win against Germany. They were willing to say and do anything they needed to get colonial support of people and supplies. Didn't matter. They would have said whatever they had to do. They were, in their view, they were fighting for their very existence, their very survival. So yeah. Adding to this Arab anger, England had also committed to this establishment of a Jewish homeland known as the Balfour Declaration, which is where England agreed to establish a Jewish homeland in the Middle East. And eventually that does come to be basically right in the middle of a country that's already there, Palestine. They'd hoped the declaration would appeal to the German, Austrian, and American Jews and help them support the war effort, which it did. We do see a lot of Jewish support for the war effort. In money, supplies, industry, and bank loans, things like this. And then, of course, there is also the anti-Semitic, which was still a very strong feeling in much of Western Europe and America. There was a lot of anti-Semitism. So there were a lot of people in government that thought it would also help ease some of that anti-Semitism by potentially relocating millions of Jews back into the Middle East. Let's see what else we have going on here. Treaty of Versailles did approve for Arab nationalism. It does actually, when it's finally ratified in 20 or 21, the treaty does approve Arab independence on some of this self-rule, some of these regions. Arabs met in Damascus. They met what became known as the General Syrian Congress to call attention to their demands for independence and freedom and self-rule. And in response, France attacked Syria in 1920, and England attacked Iraq in 1920 as well. And these became regions that were completely, pretty much dominated by England and France till after World War II. Yeah. Very messy. And really, we're just really covering the very surface of it. You could spend a whole class just talking about this one slide probably. But again, this is a survey course. We just touch on things. Pick your interest. And then go and do research if any of this really, really interests you. Go and do research or take other classes on it. Okay, so we have the Turkish Revolution here. Mustafa Kemal, he was a leader and a general with the Ottoman Empire. And during the war, again, the Ottoman Empire was the enemy, was part of the enemy states. He defeated an attack in the Dardanelles region, which is basically the water region right off the coast of Turkey, sort of the watery region between the Middle East and Europe. Defeated England, an invasion there. The war ends, the Ottoman Empire collapses. He's, of course, very anguished by this, very upset by it when the Ottoman Empire ends. We have a Greek invasion of Turkey, which England assisted with this, a British assistance. This inspired very nationalistic fervor. It inspires people in what we call Turkey here. This is what becomes Turkey. To defeat the Greeks, they won their independence in the Treaty of Lausanne. All of that amounts to Kemal becoming the leader of the Turks. So he becomes famous fighting against the British during the war. We have the Treaty of Lausanne signed in 23, to where the Greeks invade Turkey. The British assist this invasion, basically an attempt to control and take over Turkey for the Greeks. That's defeated. And Turkey gets this independence in 23 with Kemal as their leader. Mustafa Kemal as their leader. He works towards building a secular state. He moves to westernize the nation. He crushes the Armenian and Kurdish ethnic minorities. He establishes a one-party system of government. He does accept Western science and law, and he does minimize Islam. He turns it into a different type of Islamic state. He turns it into a modern, more secular Islamic state. Most Middle Eastern countries have basically Islamic law as the rule of the country. They're ruled by Islamic leadership. Whether it's Sunni, Shia, they're run by Islamic leadership, and they use often Islamic law to rule the country. It's not usually a separate law. He wanted a pretty much independent, and he actually gets a constitution written, which is mirrored on Western countries. It's ironic in a way. He despised the Western countries, but yet he used them as examples: modernization, bringing in science, law, changing clothing, minimizing the Islamic religion, making it into more of a Western state. And of all the Middle Eastern countries, other than what becomes Israel, it is probably the most Western state. Westernized. And it's not surprising why years later it does actually becomes the first Middle Eastern nation that becomes part of NATO. Its geographic location as well. Basically, it's also used as a buffer between the West and the Soviet Union as well. It's very interesting. It is nominally a democratic state, but it's really still a one-party system. It's still sort of a strongman rule with some democratic elements. Eventually they do elect a Congress. It's interesting. It becomes a pseudo-democratic wannabe state, but never really gets there. Especially regarding issues of civil rights. But compared to most other Middle Eastern states, it is significantly more Western than most, and maybe the only really secular Middle Eastern state, Muslim state. Modernization efforts in Persia and Afghanistan. Early conflicts between Russia and Great Britain and Persia ended with the British and Russians splitting it into two spheres of influence. So we have the Bolshevik Revolution taking place. Great Britain quickly moved in on the Northern Territory to keep it out of communist hands, and eventually controlling all of Persia. Anti-British movements brought Reza Shah Pahlavi into a military dictatorship. His objectives were to build a modern nation, remove foreign power, and rule with an iron fist. Iran. The Shah won control over minorities, cut back on the privileges granted to foreigners, increased taxes on the English Persian Oil Company. Finally, attempts to secularize the country by removing Muslim influence and made many Middle Eastern enemies doing so. British control in Afghanistan was cut short by a holy war. After winning its independence from England, Afghanistan moved into a series of tribal wars, religious revolts, which last for most of the rest of the century. With Islam becoming the religion and also the law of Afghanistan, independent but religiously very strict. So the history of all this shows England stepping in anywhere it can in the Middle East, trying to take power away from Russia, trying to take control over oil fields, oil territory, natural resource opportunities, gold, things like this. I haven't really mentioned it, but there's gold mines as well. And then we see some people in the Middle East, in Iran, for instance, Afghanistan, going two different directions. Iran going to try to be more secular. It eventually does fail. It becomes a very religious state eventually. But wanting to try and basically secularize. And then you have Afghanistan, which goes the other direction and becoming a very religious state. Ultimately, over the next 50 years, we see most Middle Eastern countries become much more religious, much more religiously dominated, more sacred dominated, and religious law dominated. And the secularization of Middle Eastern countries fails generally. And there's a lot of reasons for this, which we're not going to get into right at the moment. We will actually talk about some of it in later chapters. Sort of the reasons why some of these countries really come to reject everything that is the West. Some of it's kind of obvious already. Westerners involved in these countries seem to generally only want one thing: resources, money, and to control the businesses, control the oil fields, things like that. In this time period where really people came to realize, especially in the West, how important oil was going to be, how significant it was going to be for the future. Much of the energy that was provided in World War I was not oil-based. Much of it was still coal-based, and oil, like natural type oil, not petroleum. Which of course is natural, but I mean like whale oil and things like that was still used very often during World War I. Kerosene, things like that. But as far as other products of traditional, more oil fuel products being taken out of oil, that comes about after the 1920s, when we realized exactly how important it is to infrastructure and important it is to competition militarily, economically in the world. And by the 1940s, half of all the world's oil was coming from the Middle East. So these lands were important in every way. They were absolutely necessary for national defense and national security for European nations. And England and France were two of the biggest. So you have Persia here, which that's really what ends up becoming Iran. India over here, Afghanistan, and you see we don't have a, totally blanked on the other country. We don't have a Pakistan yet. Pakistan hasn't happened yet. All right, gradual independence in Arab states. We see states in the Middle East, Arab states especially, becoming more independent, generally because England and France simply didn't have the ability to control them. They simply couldn't control these territories. The British chose Faisal bin Hussein to be the king of Iraq. Faisal worked closely with the British government, accepted British control of the Iraqi oil fields. The king gained the support of the people and became a popular king. By 1932, Faisal had secured Iraq's independence by agreeing to a long-term military alliance with the British, which extended all the way into the 1990s. Pardon me. Egypt had been a British protectorate. By 1922, Egypt was declared formally independent, although the British military continued to occupy it until 1936. To ensure, this was probably mostly about trade routes. The trade routes which went from the Middle East through the Red Sea and through the Mediterranean had to be controlled, and Egypt was a big part of that. Egypt was a big part of controlling, maintaining those trade routes and assuring the safety and security of those trade routes. The French had control of Syria following the war. Syria won independence in 1936, agreeing to become a French ally under a treaty. So these nations do eventually get their independence, although there's all kinds of stipulations, agreements, and economic requirements, or even military requirements to be allies, to accept trade route, to continue buying these European goods from England and France at discounted rates. Some of these contracts, there's records of some of these contracts being instituted and written for 99 years. That they had to basically continue to do business in different ways, or accept military occupation, or accept the leasing of military bases or land for bases, because England and France had bases in all these countries. And they had to accept them for many, many years. Some as far as 99 years. Arab-Jewish tensions in Palestine. Jewish nationalism, or what we call Zionism. The desire, there's nothing bad about, I've heard negative content. There's nothing negative about it. It's simply a desire for a Jewish state. The desire for Jewish people to have their own state, their own country, their own land. This idea of Zionism. This idea of Zionism can be dated all the way back to the mid-1800s. When it was officially termed, I couldn't say, but there's ideas of Jews wanting their own land and their own place in the world going back to the mid-1800s, and who knows, probably further, but at least officially, where we see records of writings about this in newspaper articles. The general belief was that was the only way they could be protected. Jewish persecution, what's known as the spreading out of the Jews around the world, known as the diaspora. In fact, the Jewish population has basically been dispersed across the globe. This was the idea that there was some place where it could bring all of them back together to where they could have a unified, protected state where they wouldn't be persecuted wherever they went. Whether it was the Americas, whether it was Europe, whether it was Asia, it didn't matter, the Middle East itself. It encouraged them worldwide to move to Palestine, which was their ancestral homeland, which it was. This was the original Jewish homeland going back potentially thousands of years. But the last time the Jewish people really were able to call this homeland was during the Roman Empire, close to 2,000 years earlier, 1,600 years earlier at least. And nonetheless, by 1939, millions had moved to Palestine. Even we don't have an Israel yet; it's not official, but we already have millions that have moved. There were some who, of course, already lived there. We have millions that have moved there, and the population in Palestine was about 50%, 50-50 by 1939, Jewish and Muslim. And the difference is the Jews had the assistance of America, England, and France backing them up militarily and economically. Palestinians do have the assistance of other Arab states. Absolutely. They have assistance of Arab Middle Eastern states, but it doesn't really compare to the military and economic might of the Western powers. Now, following World War I, we have England continuing to support the idea of a Jewish state, even though there are many Arab protests. The Arab people are very clear. They very clearly understand what's happening. They very clearly understand that the Jews are basically trying to move in and take over with the assistance of the British and the Americans as well. And then land purchases go through the roof to where we see hundreds and hundreds of thousands of acres being purchased up by Brits and by the Jews, often through this Jewish National Fund. There was this tradition among Jewish communities in many places in the Americas, in North America and in Europe, to where families would donate. They would constantly donate. They'd put money in a jar. There was a special name for it. I'm sorry, I don't know what it is off the top of my head. And they would donate, and then this money would be sent to wherever wherever the headquarters were, this Jewish National Fund, and it would be used to purchase land in the Middle East, and specifically Palestine. And eventually they purchase up almost the entirety of the center of Palestine is purchased up, bought from landowners, Palestinian landowners, who often gave it up because they were being paid well for their land. For them, it was just a business deal. They were simply having their lands or homes purchased. But really what it was a massive conspiracy, and it's a word you can use. It was a massive international conspiracy to basically buy up as much land as possible in Palestine to create a Jewish homeland. It wasn't necessarily public, at least not the greater picture of it was. It also wasn't exactly hidden either. It wasn't something that was necessarily secretive, but yet the bigger picture of this greater international agenda to basically purchase and build a country in the middle of another country, one piece of land at a time, wasn't really obvious until it was certainly too late for the Palestinians. Lots of Arab resentment of Jews and the British, and further extended by that also the Americans, who definitely participated in this. Issues of resentment towards British policies, American policies, Jewish, British military buildup and monetary assistance. Eventually we start to see attacks on Jews in Palestine, massacres of Jews. All the things that they've been saying were going to happen, this persecution and violence starts to happen. Starts to actually come about, which creates greater feelings of I don't know the right word for it, greater feelings of Western countries wanting to help Jews, wanting to help Jewish populations trying to move there because of the way they were being further. The more and more they moved there, the greater their population, the more persecution and attacks, and people were being killed, and there was bombings, terrorism, all this going on, creates greater, I don't know, I can't think of the word, but it creates a lot more feelings of people trying to help and assist the Jewish population to basically fight back against this type of violence. Arab pressure eventually forces the British government to slow Jewish immigration. They're actually required to, under some different policies instituted in England, to actually slow the immigration of Jewish populations. This was government assisted and subsidized, much of it. Well, the difference is enough money had actually been raised by the Jewish National Fund by private Jewish donors around the world, primarily Western Europe and America, that Jews could still move there. There was no way to stop the influx. By this point in time, by the 30s, it was apparent what was happening, and the news had gotten out to the world, and Jews were flocking from around the world to move into the Middle East because of this belief that there was eventually going to be a Jewish state, which does, of course, happen. And so the British government tries to slow this immigration E out of England and immigration I into the Middle East, but it doesn't slow. It really doesn't slow down. The Jews just find their own ways there. They pay for their own passage, their own flights, their own ships, and there's a lot of resources available to them to try and get in there. This does anger some Jewish people that the government isn't assisting as much. Of course, it angers Arab populations, worried that there's going to be too many coming in. Jewish concerns often mirrored around, well, if you're going to stop the flow of us going there, then maybe there's not going to be a Jewish state. And so it was concerning on all sides. Now, most of the Jews that did actually move into the Middle East were generally urban. They were generally from urban areas in Western Europe and America, not rural. Some did go there to become basically farmers. They basically became commune farmers, and what we call these agricultural organizations known as the kibbutz were established. Basically, they're communal, collective farms where they're supposed to share equally in work and rewards, and eventually they really become sort of these large, and they actually end up taking up more land than anyone else, these large scale with hundreds of Jewish farmers living on these large agricultural farms. And with the assistance of the government and the assistance of more financially comfortable Jews, we see more and more land purchases. To the point of, by 1940s, almost the entirety of central Palestine is controlled economically and politically by Jewish communities. And we do have a population by the mid-40s that the Jewish population is actually greater than the Muslim population in Palestine. Even though it wasn't official yet, even by the early 40s, it was apparent that there was nothing that could really stop this formation of this new Jewish state. And that's where we end. We will talk more about that in the chapter when we talk about the aftermath of World War II. We will shift over to India now. This is where I'd be like, questions. But lots of questions about that. And again, if you want to know more about it, there's so much more you can read about it. You can look up and find more information. Towards self-rule in India. English promises and repression. We see a very strange pairing in India where Muslims and Hindus sort of come together to force out their English oppressors. Interesting. Indian suffering during World War I. We see a lot of war dead. Again, over 1 million Indians fought in World War I, actually in Europe. Who knows how many others fought in Asia. War dead, famine, high taxes. We see lots of nationalist movements. The idea of nationalist movements which push towards independent self-rule, have an independent nation. We see this game movement all through India. Hindu leaders and the Muslim leaders. The Muslim, have it on here, don't I? I don't have it on the slide here. The Muslim League. We see Hindu leaders and the Muslim League entering into what's called the Lucknow Pact. And in essence, we have Hindus and Muslims uniting in an agreement to force out the British any way possible to regain control of their nation, which was still primarily Hindu. The British responded with this, issued with government self-rule reforms, hoping to basically give them some limited rule to appease them, to make them happy, but maintaining British control of the economy, taxes, and the police. Some limited self-rule, with England controlling the most important things, taxes, police, trade, things like that, the economy. Much of these reforms were undermined by the Rowlatt Acts, 1919. The Rowlatt Acts extended emergency measures. They extended emergency measures to curb unrest, rioting, revolutionary ideas, root out conspirators. The Rowlatt Acts infuriated Indians, resulted in more riots. So the whole purpose of the Rowlatt Acts was to sort of put down these revolutionary self-rule movements. The British were going to give them some things, give them some concessions, to give them some dominance, some authority, and the Hindu population wanted much more. The entire Indian population wanted much more than this. And so the Rowlatt Acts are put in to basically oppress and to keep down any type of free speech or protest movements about self-rule, which only makes things worse. Makes more people angry and violent. Then we have a disaster that happens here with the Sikh festival. The attendees of a Sikh religious festival, Sikhs are a different religious group. It's sort of a syncretic religious group, sort of a middle road between Hindu and Muslim, but it is, by this point in time, entirely independent and separate. That's sort of how it began, was sort of a syncretic blend of Hindu-Muslim, but now it is entirely unique and independent. We had a religious festival. Apparently, at the same time this festival was begun, there was a rule implemented by the British government that said the festival was banned. But literally, like, issued within 24 hours, almost the same day as the festival. They didn't get word of it. The festival went ahead and happened anyway. The British general there, Reginald Dyer, he sent his troops in, and he ordered them to fire. He ordered them to attack the crowd, because in his estimation, it was an illegal gathering from a banned festival. We see basically a mass murder here, a massacre. 400 people killed, 1,000 people injured. This becomes known as the Amritsar Massacre. This added fuel to nationalistic fervor, and we see basically, by around the early 20s, we see the entire country on the edge of anarchy and civil war. The British had done something that the Indian people had never managed to do themselves: unite all of their religious factions. The Brits had managed to bring the Sikhs, the Muslims, and the Hindus all together, and they had never really ever been united, ever, in their beliefs. The British managed to do this. Enemy of my enemy is my friend, kind of thing. And so we see these massacres happening. This is the biggest one, but there were a dozen times British soldiers fired on Muslims and Hindus gathering, protesting, at least a dozen times. Hundreds of casualties over several years. This is a huge country that was basically teetering on anarchy and total uprising, and had been for several years. And they come in to this picture, Gandhi. Mohandas K. Gandhi, we're going to talk about where he gets that. He gets a title. He gets a special title. We'll talk about that in a moment. Mohandas K. Gandhi, he grew up in a privileged environment. He was basically wealthy, from a wealthy family. He studied law in Great Britain. Eventually he does returns to India. He then goes to South Africa to represent as a lawyer, represent his Indian countrymen, which are basically being treated as slaves in South Africa. They're not technically slaves, but they're effectively slaves, working in the mines and the fields. Subject to brutal discriminatory laws. They weren't allowed to vote. They had no suffrage. They were forced to basically work as practical slaves. Low life expectancy, high imprisonment rate. He was actually arrested and almost lynched himself, and almost executed himself while he was in South Africa. Very rough. Defending his Indian population, and even blacks, even defending some black South Africans against the British rule in South Africa. Gandhi developed a weapon to fight back against oppression, to fight for the poor, the oppressed, to fight against oppressors, militant states. What's called his soul force is what he called this, the soul force, a means of striving for truth and justice through love, suffering, and eventually converting your oppressor over to your cause. This, what becomes this satyagraha, this version of the soul force, which is almost eventually becomes sort of a version of Hinduism. It's an offshoot of a different version of Hinduism, which is all about peace and love and nonviolence, and he extends this to be a way of protecting those that cannot be protected, or they can't protect themselves. this nonviolent, what we will call in later years in the United States, nonviolent civil disobedience. Nonviolently disobeying the law. There's a version here of conversion that isn't exactly what we use here in the U.S., which becomes popular during the Civil Rights Movement. The conversion is really important here. Getting to convert your oppressor, your jailer, if you will, over to your cause and your belief through your own personal suffering. Basically, they feel such compassion for you and feeling of pain for what you're going through that they will eventually come to understand your belief and to find maybe your belief is correct. That's the hope anyway. He organized these nonviolent movements in South Africa to try and help his own populations, to help Indian populations, to also speak out against restrictions on Asian immigration. Demonstrators were beaten, arrested, tortured. Eventually, over time, Gandhi has success in getting South African government to abolish these discriminatory taxes, discriminatory rules and laws, discriminatory legal measures, and to actually recognize non-Christians, and to even eventually give freedom of movement and ability to own property and land to Indian immigrants, of which there were thousands that were working there in South Africa. Doesn't do much to really help South African blacks. It's primarily helping South African Indian immigrants. He then goes back to India and uses these same ideas to help with Indian independence. He returns, he was hailed as Mahatma, became known as Mahatma Gandhi, the Great Soul. He organized a nonviolent boycott of British goods and jobs to protest the injustices forced on the Indian population. The boycott excites the people, influences a political revolution in India. He becomes a national hero almost overnight. Call for nonviolent resistance appealed to the Hindu population, especially the lower caste members. There was the Indian caste system, which I'm not going to go into right now. The lower caste system was often seen, the poor, the lower were often seen as weak or cowards by the British, illiterate masses. This is the majority of the population. Generally, the upper castes were much more likely to be friendly with the British. Upper castes were more likely to have better jobs, careers, better education, also more likely to be lighter skinned, more closer to the color of the British, of European skin. The lower castes, skin color was often an indicator of your caste in the Indian system. But not as much. Today, caste is often associated with your job. Your job is often associated with your caste, but the Indian caste system is still well and strong today. Gandhi managed to transform the Indian National Congress into a political party that accepted every ethnic group and every religious view. They've proved to be willing to work with the Muslims, and we do basically create a full-on unification of Indian population against the British rule. A very violent attack happened in the early 20s, killed 22 policemen. Gandhi was not involved in this, but many of his followers, or people who claimed to follow Gandhi, were involved, and so he was often blamed for it. He was blamed for, in essence, inciting the riot and the violence, even though he had nothing to do with it. He was imprisoned for over 2 years by the British. During this time, the Indian National Congress splintered into factions. Gandhi worked for years to reunite the factions, while the radical nationalists, led by Jawaharlal Nehru, 1929, called for immediate independence or for an outright war against the British. So I'll sort of sum all this up at the end. More protests, thousands, tens of thousands arrested over the 20s and the 30s. We see negotiations between the British and Gandhi lead to a new constitution identified, known as the Government of India Act, which increased Indian parliamentary representation. That satisfied some people in India. So he was successful in working out problems with the British. Gandhi failed to solve the issues between the Hindus and Muslims. Basically, the partnership between Hindus and Muslims, which had allowed them to eventually push off the British, or at least get a lot of self-rule from the British, fractures. It really was only held together by their joint hatred of the Brits. Indian nationalism was largely based on the Hindu culture. The vast majority of the population was Hindu culture, which of course that bothered the Muslim culture. 90% of the population was Hindu. So the Muslims were, no matter what they did, they were always going to be a minority. They were always going to be a small group. The culture, the politics, the entire system, the entire way of life in India was basically governed by Hinduism. Islam was never really accepted or never really became any type of dominance in most of India. In contrast, we also see the Muslim League leaders begin to call for their own nation, a land of the pure, which becomes Pakistan. That again doesn't happen in this time period. Pakistan happens from, I'm going to say like 47, somewhere around 47 is when Pakistan, I think that's right. It happens just right after the war. And basically northwestern India, during the wartime period, we see this calls for a greater Muslim nation, and we see most Muslims move to western and northwestern India, and then when Pakistan is formed, we see almost every Muslim in India actually relocate into, either relocate east or west. As opposed to about 10% of the population being Muslim in this time period, by the time we get to the 1950s, there's only about a 1 or 2% Indian population that's Muslim. A corner of the country is basically carved out for Islam, and then those that are left in the other parts of the country go east and leave India out the east border, to where India is almost exclusively a Hindu nation by the 1950s and 60s. So what is all this? Gandhi comes back, basically riles up the people, creating a general mass movement across the country, which is supposed to be peaceful, nonviolent, going on boycotts, going on food strikes where they wouldn't eat, they would just have big sit-ins, all this idea to basically protest the British government and the way the Brits were treating the Indian population. The majority of the population rise up, both Hindus and Muslims working together. We see a new constitution written. We see lots of imprisonment happening for him and others. And eventually, by the late 1930s, we see England pretty much not out of India. They're not completely out of India. They're not. They have given, basically, through this Government of India Act, almost independent self-rule by the late 30s. Although technically, England is still there. And India is still a large participant in World War II. We see millions of Indian populations assisting and helping in World War II as well. And full independence doesn't come until after the war, after World War II. But the influence of England on India cannot be overstated. It's still one of the official languages in India today is English language. Almost all educated Indian people speak English. By educated, I mean like college educated. It is still a large illiterate population. Even today in India, the amount of population that live in abject poverty is greater than the entire population of the United States. It's still one of the most impoverished nations on the planet. Even though it is in its cities fully industrialized, they've got huge technology centers. It's a really unusual country. It's basically both sides of the coin. Here you have huge industrialization, industry, business, factories, tech centers, etc. And then you go a few miles over that direction, and you have people basically still living in the mud and the dirt. It's very it's interesting. It's an interesting nation. I did not talk about the Salt March. I'm not going to mention that. You can look that up if you're interested in that. British rule, protected states under Indian administration, partial self-rule. There's the Amritsar massacre, the Sikh massacre there. I don't think there's anything else I want to say off of this. All right, let's look at China. Rise of nationalist China. And I know I'm going to say some of these names wrong, so forgive me, please. I don't mean to. Wang Shigai was involved in the 1911 revolution to overthrow the Qing. He was involved in the overthrow of the government in 1911. That's basically where we have the imperial government defeated. Once he was elected president, he focused on accumulating all power. He became a dictator. He ended China's parliament, took control of the military, leading China into a one-man dictatorship. We see a student protest against the Versailles Treaty in 1919, which leads to a very interesting development, basically a movement against all foreign powers and foreign involvement in the country. For too long, many of these people believed, which comes to become the majority of the country, comes to believe that the West has done nothing but cause problems in China. Whether religious issues, whether government issues, economic issues. Then, of course, China was our ally in World War I, and they basically got nothing out of it. All along, while they're our ally, we are not stepping in when Japan is taking parts of China. We're not doing anything about that. We're not doing anything there. The only time we put our military forces into China is when we are worried about any type of uprising that's going to affect the West's economic gains or economic trade with the West. So the general feeling becomes in China that the West is the enemy for religious, economic, military, political, trade reasons, all the above. And they also come to hate Japan, too. They basically all outsiders. But they do find a friend in the Soviets. Not that they get along with everything the Soviets get along with, but China does become a communist government, and the Soviets are communist, and the Soviets are anti-West. They share a border with China, and they both basically got screwed in the Treaty of Versailles. They got nothing out of it. And they both want to expand territories, get more land, and grow. In essence, they have a lot of commonalities for their enemies and for their desires to increase nationalistic power, to increase their land and territories and get access to more natural resources. Very interesting. We had this May the 4th movement, which is really what we're talking about here. This is the student movement, this May the 4th movement, 1919. Certainly was anti-capitalistic, anti-imperialist, and pro-Soviet, pro-Bolshevik. Sun Yat-sen, he allied his national party, Kuomintang, this national party, with the Chinese Communist Party to form a National Liberation Party. He wasn't a communist, he was a nationalist, though. But he formed this National Liberation Party, trying to find a middle ground and a way forward. This new nationalist party, these key points of it were nationalism, democracy, and people's livelihood. He hoped that this nationalist party could reunite China and make it stronger for the future. Make a strong economic powerhouse, which it had all the ingredients. The population, the resources, the land, the trade. It had everything it needed to become an economic powerhouse, which it does eventually. It just doesn't quite happen yet. And he saw the future of this. But he believed he had to bring all the political factions together, which they do form this nationalist party, which is a combination of this communist national party and the more liberal sort of national party, brings them together. Yeah, it doesn't work very well. Jiang Jieshi replaces Sun Yat-sen as leader of this new party. Sun's sudden death, probably killed, probably assassinated. Still isn't clear whether he was assassinated or whether it was just naturally poisoned, or some type of food poisoning or something. But we'll never know, of course. But he very well could have been assassinated. Jiang Jieshi takes over and makes Nanjing the new capital of China in the time period. The nationalists and the communists were suspicious of each other. Soon they entered into a bitter and deadly rivalry. 1927, Jiang Jieshi and the nationalists moved against the communists, killed thousands, and forced them into hiding. This was the first time Mao was defeated. And I haven't even mentioned him on here because he really becomes important later in the 30s. Mao Zedong is a general, a leader in the Communist Party. So, we have a dictatorship initially. We get the May the 4th movement, which basically brings in a new type of more democratic nationalist party. There is the traditional Communist Party, which is basically a descendant of Shige's dictatorship. Sun Yat-sen manages to bring them all together. We get a nationalist and a communist working together for a one unified national party. For several years, this works. This idea of this unified national party, which is going to basically modernize and bring it into the future. But they have a hard time doing that because they want to reject Western ideas in many ways, so they're basically self-reliant. They want to rely on themselves. That only gets so far. Jiang Jieshi comes in, replaces, moves the capital, tries to change the priorities. And when he does this, he believes the priorities of the National Party are different than the Communist Party. He moves more Western idea. He starts to be more interested in Western ideas and getting more Western association and Western business deals, believing that is the future. The fact that the Europeans and the Americans are dominating global trade and economics and military, he starts moving that direction. The Chinese Communist Party is very much against this. They are more friendly towards the Soviets and more generally wanting more independence, more looking inward again. This has really been the problem with China for much of its history, its entire focus inward. If China had ever really focused outward, they could have been the ones maybe global dominant instead of Europe. They certainly had everything they needed to do that. The communists and the nationalists get into a war, basically a civil war that lasts, 2 years, and they defeat the communists. The problem was they didn't kill them. If you notice what I said a couple minutes ago, they went into hiding. What they do is they defeat the communist army, which basically disappears in northern China and just goes away for a few years. As we're going to find out later, the whole time they were gone, they were building up. And when they come back with a vengeance. That's the mid-30s. Alright, so we get this new culture movement which attacked traditional Chinese culture, particularly Confucian virtues, which had basically been the core of Chinese culture for 2,000 years. This idea of Confucianism, filial piety, take care of your neighbor, take care of your brother, the Golden Rule, which way predated Christianity, this Confucian idea of do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. Treat others the way you want to be treated. This Golden Rule of Confucius, again, predated Christianity by, 500 years or something like that, 400 years, a very long time. Paternalism is respect for the father, respect for the family line, which also, by extension, meant you needed to respect the government, respect the emperor. It's not an emperor anymore, but you needed to respect authority in general. This idea of paternalism and expect authority. Subservience to father, subservient to the country. And of course, this new culture movement, as I already mentioned previous slide, really put more of a focus on Western ideals. Western ideals of modernization and technology and culture even. That threatened a lot of people. It really threatened a lot of people, this idea of bringing in all this Western stuff, which China had for almost its entire history tried to reject all the time, outside influence. We also see a growth of Bolshevik communism. Ends up gaining a large following, promising prosperity and freedom from Western dominance. We see the exact opposite, moving away from the Western ideas, Western government, Western imperialism, Western capitalism. All evil words. For many Chinese, they come to believe everything that is West represents evil and bad. And this generally is sort of formed under this idea of this Chinese communism, which is really modeled on Russian communism. Mao Zedong, he becomes a peasant leader after realizing Chinese peasants had a revolutionary potential, desires. He rises through the ranks quickly. He converts to this Marxist, Bolshevik communism, revolutionary communism, and of course, the Marxist revolutionary communism, such as was espoused by Lenin in this time period, would have said violent revolution is the only way. Violent revolution is the only way. Basically, you can only achieve true freedom through death. You have to kill those that stand in your way. Harsh, but not unusual for world history. The belief that for revolution or revolt or change, you basically had to kill all the people at the top and start all over. That, of course, has been done countless times in human history. Yeah. So, he does convert to this Marxist socialism, this sort of, Russian version of the socialism, organized laborers, organized peasant strikes. Definitely their first target's the Japanese, because the Japanese are the ones that are really, first of all, Japanese are westernized. We've talked about this time period, Japan is completely westernized, culturally, economically, militarily. They're entirely westernized. They're friends with the West, although they don't really like the West. They're friends with Western countries, Europe and America. They use them to become powerful. Well, Japan was taking over land and territory, building factories and plants in Chinese territory, and Mao first was targeting them, saying how bad the Chinese were reflecting the West, everything they're doing is Western style, so we hate that. He leads attacks, he attacks Chinese textile plants, Japanese textile plants and factories. This is all in China, by the way, it's not in Japan. And in Korea as well. He leads attacks then further upon the Chinese National Party, because the Chinese National Party is friendly with the West, actually has trade deals with the United States, for instance. And they have a problem with that. This is the proletariat uprising. His first peasant revolt, the Autumn Harvest uprising, wasn't successful. We know how it wasn't successful. We see the whole communist uprising in the 20s eventually put down, and the communists go running and hiding. However, he doesn't die, he isn't captured, and he runs off into northern China and hides with his followers, and eventually builds another large army after several years. He learned lessons, he learned what to do, what was right, what was wrong. He was a smart guy. He was a terrible, evil person. The kind of destruction and death he brings upon China later years after he takes over China ranks him right up there with Stalin and Hitler. But nonetheless, Stalin, Lenin, Hitler, whatever, right up there towards the top, he's a really bad dude. But he's incredibly charismatic, I guess would be the word. And he's apparently a good military strategist. And he convinces the majority of the Chinese population that he's got the right idea, and yeah, eventually leads a massive revolt and takes over China in the 1930s. Let's see what else we want to talk about here. Areas under communist control, different dates, areas occupied by Japan. Yeah. Now, that's really getting ahead of ourselves here. This is talking about the Japanese occupation as we move into World War II. That's a little bit ahead. But even before 1938, there's large parts of Manchuria, northeastern China up here that are controlled by Japan long before the war. Japan had been taking territories on the Chinese coast, east coast. Like I think all the way back to 1921. So all the way back to 21, Japanese were basically taking territories on East Asia long before the war, long before their full-scale invasions of China in 31 and again in 37. I actually had a picture in here, but for some reason I don't have it in my slides, so let's see if I have it. Nope. Apparently I took it out. Oh well. From liberalism to nationalism in Japan. Took a minute there to go back and look at the picture and decided I'm going to use it. It's really, I think it's significant. I think it's an important thing to put in. So let's see, I put it back in, I believe. There it is. The fate of a Chinese patriot. The majority of Chinese population was illiterate. The vast majority. So, without even knowing what the language is here, without even understanding, you need to look at this as a typical Chinese peasant. It's very obvious. And this is the kind of thing that would have been used as propaganda for the Communist Party, for Mao, and to show how terrible capitalism was, imperialism was, and how terrible the Japanese were, and by extension, the West. First of all, you have the guy on the top, the Japanese man at the top, who's in the top hat and coat, which would represent businessmen, capitalism, economic power, which would have been, again, it's sort of an American style, a European Western style, so that would have reflected the West. Then you have a Japanese general there. Evil looks on their faces, evil, vile looks on their faces as they're killing this man, as they're killing this peasant, choking him to death. Obviously, a general, a warlord of some sort, a Japanese warrior with a sword and everything. So the reflection here would have made it very clear who the evil people in this picture were. You didn't have to be able to read it. Understood that they were evil, they were bad, and killing the Chinese man in the center would have certainly led credence to the stories of massacres of Chinese civilians, which they did happen. The problem with Mao is a lot of the shit he was saying was actually true. The Japanese were doing terrible things to the Chinese. Terrible. We haven't even gotten into some of the atrocities the Japanese were committing against the Chinese and the Koreans. Bad stuff. We'll talk more about that later. Violent massacres of Chinese citizens, rapes, burning of entire towns, bad stuff. So one of the reasons Mao was successful is what he was saying was actually happening. And now the Chinese Nationalist Party wasn't doing this. It was the Japanese who were doing this. But the problem is the Chinese Nationalist Party was welcoming in Western ideas, Western technology, and Western culture, which was therefore reflected in everything that was Japanese. Even though the Chinese National Party was certainly against the Japanese, and were trying to resist the Japanese, which were, even though there was not technically an invasion, it was practically, they had been invading parts of China since the 20s. But they weren't able to stop them. The Japanese were far more militarily industrialized. They simply weren't able to stop the Japanese. And who were our allies? We were technically an ally. The U.S. was technically an ally with China, an economic partner. It may not have been officially written up in a treaty, but we had been working economically with China for years, trade and business. We weren't doing anything to stop the Japanese. We were still trade partners with the Japanese. So there was nothing really positive about the West. There was no way that the Nationalist Party could really make a positive argument that, oh, the West is good, the U.S. is good, England and France are good. Where? Yes, maybe you could say, oh, they've given us all kinds of money. They did. The United States gave billions of dollars to China in this time period, which that was a ton of money back then. Billions of dollars to China, the nationalists, to try and defeat the communists, to try and fight against Mao. We gave billions of dollars to them. We never really gave military aid, though. We gave advisors, we gave food, we gave good trade deals. We actually did a lot. But we never actually, invaded, which is what would have probably had to have happened to really save China, probably. So all these types of imagery was very effective because a lot of it was actually true. A lot of it was really happening. The Japanese were brutalizing much of the Chinese population. And they represented everything that was West and imperial. So, yeah, this is a lot of very effective stuff. It really was. And don't get me wrong, all the blame can't be laid on Japanese here. The Americans did this, the British did this, the French did this, the Portuguese did this. For centuries, China had basically been plundered and invaded and used and taken advantage of by Western powers. Just the current one that was doing most of the bad shit was the Japanese, which isn't Western. But they represented Westernization because of their advancements in industrialism and technology, which they basically borrowed from us in France and England. So they represented us, even though they would not have been thought of as Western. In Chinese minds, they might have been thought of as that way. Maybe. See what else you want to mention here. Chinese leaders were seen as ineffective, ineffectual. They were complicit. They were thought as complicit. The warlords, of course, were enemies, foreign, Western, or Japanese. Communism was very appealing because it was thought it could overthrow the corrupt and incompetent elites. It could overthrow the nationalist government, which was basically in cahoots with the West and Japanese, even though they weren't in cahoots with the Japanese at all. And the nationalist government couldn't really convince enough people how much the West was doing. Even though the West was giving billions of dollars and supplies and food to China, the United States especially, it didn't seem to make a difference. What people could see daily was the terrible things that the Japanese were doing, and their lives didn't seem to be getting any better. Yeah. All right, for liberalism and nationalism in Japan. Again, we're shifting gears. We're moving over to Japan now. Japan was the most industrial, militarily powerful nation in Asia after World War I. They used this power to expand and grow and to dominate their neighbors, the islands around them, Korea, China. All right. The growth of the Japanese population had become a problem. Japan was a small island nation with limited space. The Japanese had scarce natural resources. Much of the island was mountainous, and much of the island was, there was volcanoes. Much of the island was actually built on volcanic rock, which was really useless for growing crops, things like that. So a lot of their land was basically useless to actually produce anything other than you could build upon it, sort of. And it was a small amount of territory. Large population, getting increasingly difficult to feed. So Japan saw control of northeast China, Korea, Taiwan as a way to feed the population, gain natural resources, grow the population, they start building cities and towns, and as protection. So this expansion, this imperialism of Japan, which Europeans and Americans have been doing forever, was their way to protect themselves, feed themselves, build new homes, expand the population, all the same things the Europeans and Americans have been doing for a very long period of time. And it also gave them this protective zone from their enemies. Ironically enough, they didn't really have any. China maybe, but China wasn't really affected. Japan didn't really have any enemies at this time period who could hurt them. China was an enemy, but couldn't really do anything to Japan. They had this inferiority complex, a national inferiority complex, combined with other cultural things. because China had taken advantage of Japan many times over the centuries. And they'd been at war with China many times. And the Japanese had been taken advantage of by the British and by the Americans and other people. And now that they had the upper hand and they were growing, expanding, they wanted their piece of it. And they were not going to be hesitant at it at all to expand and show their power and authority. The Zaibatsu, or giant conglomerate firms, giant businesses, giant business firms. They employed large numbers of people. They owned numerous interrelated businesses, monopolies, huge corporate business complexes, entire industries in Japan owned by individual families. Very interesting how it was run. Countries like Mitsubishi, for instance, most people are familiar with that. Large portion of Japan's economy, they controlled a lot of it. This resulted in financial oligarchies and government corruption and crime. Even today, the largest crime syndicate on the globe is still the Yakuza in Japan, the Japanese Yakuza. They're the largest crime syndicate on the world even today, involved in every single criminal activity you could imagine, and globally. Now, many of these families became corrupt. They became oligarchical. They basically came to control the government, to have the greater say in the government, to where it was all about family name, who made the decisions, who made the rules. This came to be how, basically, this is how Japan was governed. Very interesting how this happened. And we sort of talked about this previously, or was it the other class? But anyway, there's a guild system which develops back in like the 1500s. This idea, this guild family-controlled industry-specific system, which becomes where individual families come to control an entire sector of the manufacturing base. And eventually this grows to this Zaibatsu, which is to where families, individual families or extended families, control entire sectors of the economy. Power of an entire sectors of the economy in the hands of one single father figure, who basically runs the entire family. And then again, you might say, well, some of these are legal enterprises. Absolutely. Some of them are legal enterprises. What they typically did, and what typically the tradition of these families was, is they would have legal enterprises, and they would then have illegal enterprises both. Almost all of them were thought to have had both. Legal and illegal. Illegal fronts, and then illegal operations behind the scenes, to further expand their power and economic authority. Japan was an allied force in World War I, as I mentioned. Japanese nationalists, they hated everything that was Western. They wanted to absorb all their culture, but they hated the idea of democracy and capitalism. They wanted the technology, the military tech. That's what they wanted. They wanted the industrialization, the factories, how to build the machines and the weapons. But they didn't want to be Western. They didn't want to be our culture. Many of them refused to even speak English, even though it's thought that most of these leaders knew English, because many of the business people they dealt with, they would never actually speak it. They knew it as a way to basically get one over on the Americans who would come over and do business dealings with them, but they themselves would not actually deign to speak the language because it was thought to be an inferior language. But you had to know your enemy. So they would learn the language just to know it, but they would never use it. Very deceptive in their business dealings. But then when you run these huge empires, legal and illegal, and you're constantly skirting the law, and you're trying to deal with government intervention, and you're doing illegal operations, and you have constant corruption and bribery, you know, you're basically, you live an entire life of being two-faced. You have to have that, you have to do that to really survive in this type of society, what basically becomes the ruling oligarchies of the entire country of Japan. Let's see, they hated everything as Western. They rejected democracy. They also rejected socialism. They did not believe in the communist, socialist, Marxist socialism. They pushed for restoration of Imperial Japan. They wanted to bring the Imperial Japan back. They wanted this, the authority of the emperor to have power again. They would assassinate moderate leaders. No one was safe in Japanese hierarchy at the upper ranks. Assassinations were common. Ninja were a real thing. In the 1900s, there were specially trained assassins that were actually trained specifically to do corporate and political assassinations silently, invisibly. And no one knows exactly how many. No one has any idea exactly how many were done. But I've read that by some estimates, 3,000 to 5,000 political leaders were assassinated from the mid-1800s to up to World War II in Japan. Thousands. Anyone who basically challenged these families, their entire families would just disappear. One night. 50 people. Gone. Never seen again. Things like this. Yeah. It was the business of running Japan and the business of running a business in Japan, anything beyond a simple mom and pop shop, literally the definition of cutthroat. A literal cutthroat. It was pretty wild. Yeah. They definitely took a rallying cry of the idea of Asia for Asians. It's also another interesting irony of how much they rejected the West, and yet the entire idea of racial superiority comes to dominate Japanese culture, of them being the superior Asians. Just like Europeans, just like whites, think of them as the superior, basically, of everyone. They think of them as the whites as the superiors, dominates racial ideology in the late 20th, early 19th century in the West and the U.S. The idea of white being right and white being superior to everything else. Japanese come to believe that they are superior to everything else. Their culture is superior. Their blood is superior. Their ideology is superior to all other Asian populations. They are, it's about them. Their rallying cry, this idea, their version of the white man's burden, referencing to something we talked about before. Asia for Asia, and basically to bring peace. This is an interesting way to be peace through domination, peace through violence. To attain peace by eliminating all your enemies, becoming the sole power. Yeah, peace through violence. It can work, actually. All depends on how much bloodshed you want, how many you're willing to kill. And the Japanese leadership, both governmental and business leadership, seems to make it quite clear in the early 1900s they're willing to kill any competition. Literally kill them all, whether it's economic or political, military competition. Japan wages a one-on-one war with China, and it's really one-sided. China cannot stop them. As it showed on that previous map, if you look back on that map, by the time of the war, which this is this goes up through 38, the war starts in 39. I guess technically 40, but basically, it's 39. Basically, it's 39. September 39, if I'm right. By the time of this, which is right before the war, World War II, a third of China is in the hands of Japan. Some of these regions up here were contested. Some of this was actually part of the Soviet Union, so not all this was China. Some of this was actually part of the USSR that Japan took. So we've got basically the entire east coast of China in the hands of the Japanese. They're even to the point of starting to build cities. Yeah, they're probably small. They're building towns, but they're starting to build. They maintain control of eastern China, some regions from as early as the early 20s, firmly in 31, and they don't actually give them back to after the war. So there's some regions, entire regions of eastern China that are in the hands of the Japanese for well over a decade or 15 years. They're building towns and cities already. They were planning on staying permanent. Had they had their way, this would have become Japan. This would have been part of Japan. And Japan would have basically been China. They would have given the opportunity. Japan would have probably taken all of China and made all of this Japanese had they given a chance, been able to do it. They were working on it. So it's a serious business. Japan has decided to wage war against China, and they're very successful at it. Japan controlled Manchuria, northern China, after the defeat of Russia. Concerned about the rising of Chinese nationalism, we see Japan officers blowing up railroads in Manchuria, of course blaming the Chinese for it. They justify a full invasion in Manchuria by Japanese forces. So what this is the Japanese blow up railroads, blame it on the Chinese, therefore saying they can invade. Oh, you're killing our people that are in northern China, so we're going to go ahead and have a full invasion to protect our population. But we know that the Japanese did it themselves. We know the Japanese actually did this themselves. We know everything about this because Japan today, for instance, is one of our greatest allies in the world. Matter of fact, the longest standing military treaty we have on paper in the world right now is with Japan. We signed it right after the war. So we basically have been a full-on military ally of Japan for over 60 years now. They are one of our greatest allies in the world. We are best buds. That doesn't mean a lot of people in Japan necessarily like us. We know there's still a general disdain in Japan for American culture. But militarily, economically, business-wise, we're like this. Two fingers right there together today. So we fully occupied Japan after the war, so we basically know everything that happened. They gave us everything. We had access to all their documents. We militarily occupied them for a decade after the war was over. So there's almost nothing that happened this time period that we don't know exactly what happened, word for word, from the actual documents. We know it all. So we know what they did. We know the entire explosion of the train lines, the Japanese people killed. The Japanese did it themselves. They basically killed their own people to make them scapegoats. Is that the right word? To instigate a war with China. They justified the occupation. The League of Nations condemns this. The League of Nations condemns it, says they should stop. Japan simply quit the international organization. They simply walked away from the League. And nothing else happens. Manchukuo in northeast China becomes a Japanese puppet state, basically controlled by Japan. Even though it is technically Chinese, it's controlled by Japan. It builds heavy industrial factories, military production, exports raw materials to Japan, stealing every single thing they can from China that they're able to do for years. This happens in the early 30s, 4 years. This invasion, I think, happens in 31, I think. I believe this invasion happens, actually, the Manchurian invasion, I believe, is 1931. I don't have it in my notes, I don't know why I don't, but I believe it's 31. These rivalries continue between the nationalists and communists in China. The nationalists tried to corner and eliminate the communists. Communists escaped. They embark on a deadly year-long 6,000-mile retreat, now identified as the Long March. 100,000 started, and maybe only 8,000 to 10,000 actually made it up to northern China, where Mao rebuilds among his Chinese peasants and is able to start an actual war and invasion. Just 2 years after this, he turns around in 36, I believe, 36, 37, and invades and basically takes over China. Japanese aggression against the Chinese increased dramatically. This is what is sometimes referred to as Asian World War II between Japan and China, although it is almost entirely one-sided. Pretty much every fight, every battle, Japan wins. They take territory after territory, city after city of the Chinese, and the Chinese can't really stop them. The Japanese occupied Nanjing. They occupy much of China. A little typo there in my notes. Okay. Don't worry about that. Japanese soldiers murdered. They raped populations of thousands. Anywhere from 200 to 300 Japanese were murdered, while anywhere up to 80,000 women purposely raped. Purposely raped by Japanese soldiers. Why? To inseminate them with the superior Japanese blood. Yeah. From 1931 to 1939, Japan is probably responsible for 1 to 2 million casualties, of which maybe a third or half of those were actual killed, and then other injuries. So 1 to 2 million casualties, 5 to 800,000 dead Chinese. Murdered by Japanese weapons of war, Japanese soldiers, bombs, things like this. This was a full-on war on China by Japan, in which China won hands down. And, who knows? Had things gone differently in World War II, China would have probably become part of Japan. Probably. At least Eastern, at least half of China would have become part of Japan. Had things gone the way the Japanese wanted. Violent, brutal, and here's another big part of this. We were allies with China. We did nothing to stop this. We gave money. We gave billions of dollars to China. Supplies, food, beneficial trade deals, things like that. What did that do? I mean, it helped. I'm sure it probably helped. But China was fighting a two-front war. They were fighting an internal war against the communists, which they won twice. They really beat the communists 2 times, in the 20s, again in the 30s. And then the third time, the communists finally managed to win again in 36, 37, and eventually takes over China. They spend a decade-long war against Japan that they lose terribly. Still, they manage to maintain a cohesive government, even though they've got internal civil wars going on over and over. Japan's doing what it's doing. Either one of these conflicts individually, China might have been able to be successful at. Had there been no Japanese involvement, China would have probably been able to put down the communists. So it is an argument that can be made, a viable argument that can be made, that if not for Japanese involvement and all the terrible things they were doing in China, China would have probably defeated the communists and maybe wouldn't be communist today, because the nationalist government was a democratic-leaning government. For almost 20 years, they tried to basically install democracy, some version of democracy in China, which eventually is defeated by the communists. But they managed to defeat them 2 times. And the third time, they were simply too weakened by everything Japan was doing, and the third time the communists were able to win, for all the things we talked about. But really, Japan is the reason we have a communist. You could probably make it. Now, we can't tell what history. We don't know what would have happened. But it seems like a valid argument to make that it's very possible we wouldn't have communism in China if it wasn't for all the stuff Japan was doing here. But that's not where it is. Today we have a massive, which is really ironic too, because the version of communism in China today is basically capitalism. It's capitalistic communism. Oh well. Thanks for going through all this with me. It's been interesting, and we'll see you next time.